Right, well, first of all, where is Ukraine? Some of you might be thinking. Head north of the sea, of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, and there's Ukraine. And it's a big country, compared with Britain, many times bigger. And to be honest, if we were to try and cover the megalithic culture of Britain in half an hour or an hour, we'd be struggling. So to do Ukraine justice, do realise we're only going to be scratching at the surface. I want to start you off, though, at Ukraine's most important site of antiquity. It's called Kamyana Mohyla. It's north of the Sea of north of the Sea of Azov. Excuse me. And why is this important? Why start here? Kamyana Mohyla is very much to Ukraine what Stonehenge is to, I think, to Britain. It's the oldest known sanctuary observatory in the world, and that in its own right makes it special. It's been nicknamed the Stone Library because it contains a huge number of megalithic petroglyphic texts. These go back to 22,000 BC, and they describe the people's rituals, their beliefs, and something of their social structure. Now, there are no traces of human settlement whatsoever at Kamyana Mohyla. It simply served as a remote sanctuary observatory, closely associated with Catalhoic in Anatolia, and also with Sumer, and these are from the times before the Black Sea flood. We know from these petroglyphs that these people called their sanctuary observatories Shunan, and that's the name we use now, and we also know that they called their land Arata. Do understand that this is thousands of years before Stonehenge, Sumer, Giza, Indus Valley. It's very much the origin to understanding the origin of civilization, and this is why it's a privilege to tell you about it. So what is Shunan? It's a huge multi-chambered cairn. I mean, it's monstrously big there. You're seeing it from a distance from the car park, but compare it to Stonehenge, it's 4 times the diameter and twice as high. So if I put Stonehenge next to it, as you would see at this distance, you know, this is a sort of mother of all stone piles. It's enormous. So come and have a closer look at it. Let's wander down the path and get close up to it, clamber up onto top and see what we've got here. Now, Lee and I were very privileged in 2006 to be invited along to the Cossack annual festival. And this is a long festival, but it terminates with a druidic ceremony blessing their people. And they do this on their most ancient sacred sanctuary site. And it's not just the Cossacks, indeed all Ukrainians that revere Shunan. The Dalai Lama has been there, and he clearly felt something very special. And loads of other Tibetans also travel here, specifically on pilgrimages. Shunan is without doubt very important, but key to it today is underneath it, there are so far discovered 62 grottos and caves, and it's in these caves that we find the petroglyphs. You won't find a great deal about this on the internet or in books because very little of it has come into English-speaking Western literature. Anatoly Kafishin, the Ukrainian, is almost certainly the world's greatest Sumerian scholar, has recognized that the petroglyphs are in Proto-Sumerian writing, and he spent a long time deciphering these, and it's from his work that I'm going to be telling you much of what we've discovered today. There was initial doubt that these petroglyphs could actually be Paleolithic, but I think the mammoth there says it all. There he is if you couldn't see him. And although some authorities said, no, it's a bull, believe you me, this is a mammoth. It's a mammoth. There's no doubt about that one. So how do we interpret these petroglyphs? You need to understand that it's not just the shapes that you see, but how their many images are combined together, and the sequence, the order, which image is above which other, or next or beside. It's semantics which we have to consider here. But from this emerge 2 very definite belief systems. I'll deal with social first because it's quicker. Throughout ancient myths, we've got this clear bond between man, the hunter, the master of beasts, and woman who's mistress of the forest, who bestows good fortune on hunting. We see this sort of symbolism in the grottos, in the grotto of the sorcerer at Shunan, where there are many images of women associated with hunting scenes. She is perhaps seen as the priestess who endows the hunt with, through her magic properties with good fortune. There's maybe a link here, thousands of years to come, with Artemis, the goddess of hunting. So we see women at this level have very much a dual function. Clearly, on the one hand, she's mistress of the home and the fire and the concepts, as we can see, of family prosperity. But she also has a role as mistress of the nature elements, which very much deals with the control of the well-being of the community. So both roles, you'll notice, connect women with fecundity and spirituality. This is a matriarchal society. Male priests came much later. So what about the spiritual culture? It's very clear that they had an understanding of the world axis. They recognized the three worlds here, the netherworld, the earthly world, and heaven. And they symbolically represent this with petroglyphs of animals. Anything to do with the earthly world is symbolized by man, mammoths, horses, deer, anything that's galloping around on the ground. But for the netherworld, they use fish and serpents positioned underneath the land-dwelling animals. And heaven clearly is symbolized with the birds above. We will come back to this in a moment. So here's an example within a petroglyph. You see the serpent clearly underneath at the bottom, and immediately above it looks like a couple of horses and a man. They're the earthly world. Immediately above that we've got heaven symbolized. It's actually a burial ritual which is shown here. And how do we know that? Well, notice the two dismembered bodies. And there is a shaman priest next to one of them. And in the uppermost part, you've got a burial mound with a body inside. I'm going to specifically come back to this petroglyph towards the end of the talk, which I think will clarify things for you. So some of these other petroglyphs, this one, 7.2 meters long, that's the width of this stage here. This is not a tiny scratching on rock. You know, this is like a Rolf Harris mural. It's big. And what have we got here? Horses, riders, ships. This is writing. It is. We've got numbers, not just the quantity of holes drilled into the rock, but the depth that they're drilled in is significant. And supremely, we've got a rhombus here, giving the 4 cardinal directions. Could this be the seasons? Oh, no. They reckoned on spring and summer as being one season. This is referring to cardinal directions. So let's take it a stage further. How do we understand how these petroglyphs are interpreted? Kafishan and other people like him have looked at other early scripts, principally from Sumer, Elam, which is Old Persia, and they're going back several thousand years BC, Catalhoyuk 6000 BC. But it is very clear that there are correspondences between all of those archaic writings, and it clearly seems to point to some central origin geographically, and Shu Nun fits that position. I draw your attention here to Kitoi. Now this is upon the sort of west end of China. And we've got very clear correspondence with Proto-Kitoyan script and what we see at Shu Nun. There's evidence here that you're looking at the earliest archive of writing in the world. And I stress, this is 22,000 BC. This goes back. Here's writing. Those are words, and it translates as this. And straight away you spot Inanna. She's the mother of the blessed country. And Shu Nun you see as the law of fate or law of destiny. Now, many of you will think, Inanna, she's from Sumer. Yeah, 3000 BC. We've got her here in Arata in Ukraine, 22,000, along with other Sumerian deities, Gatam Dug, Nindar, Utu, Enlil, Anu. They're here in Ukraine long, long before they appear in Sumer. Here's another example of a petroglyph. I'm 2 meters tall. This thing's 2.5 meters wide. It's not a tiny scratching on rock. It's very clear and very deliberate. You've got 7 sentences here in Proto-Sumerian script. And I'll just take those little words, which translate as this, and put that into English. It talks of the Anunnaki have no equal to themselves. Now, I was gobsmacked when I saw this. You just think, Anunnaki, Sumer, 3,500 BC, rethink. Arata civilization, 22,000 BC, centered in Ukraine. I find this fascinating. The whole of that panel translates, well, not all of it, I've summarized it a bit, but 54 wise men were secretly killed according to the hand law of fate, ordainments from poured water, and the sun god Utu. At the water court of Mish, Lama, high priest of Zagan, withdrew souls and bound seed to the great bird. Now, even if we got the words in the wrong order, you can see here we're talking about rulers and priests, legal structures, divination by pouring water, capital punishment, concepts of souls and the afterlife, and the Sumerian gods, rename them. Well, so much for Shu Nun. It's big. I'll come back to it in a moment. But let me take you further north up the mighty river Dnipro into central Ukraine to Hortitsia. This is a riverine island, and it's very, very special to the Cossacks. We were fortunate, as I say, to be invited along to the Cossack festival, and it's a right colourful affair where the groups of contestants from all of the elite Slavic nations gather together for displays and competitions, and it's boisterous fun. I'll show you that just because it's a nice picture. But let me get back to primitive stuff. On Hortitsia Island, there is a stone circle which we went to see called Brigania. It's about 5,000 BC, 12 meters diameter, and they call it a step pyramid. And I look at this thing, not a pyramid that I know as pyramids. But in Ukraine, the step pyramids are what you would, at the moment, think of as burial mounds, barrows, except that barrows are very, very different. This mound has been removed, and all you're looking at is the central area with a ring of curbstones around it. There is a sun-sighting stone on the periphery labelled A, and this site is also of interest, not just because of solar alignments, but Tibetan lamas regularly make pilgrimages to Hortitsia Island because they recognise that this is their origin point, and they have the records to show that. We were very fortunate to be introduced at this site to Professor Yuri Shilov, who is, I would say, Ukraine's foremost archaeologist. He studied hundreds of sites from the Carpathians all the way across the Urals. This is a lifetime study. He's the author of many definitive textbooks and research papers. He is giving the Ukrainians back their history, and that makes him somewhat of a political figure as well with the ear of the president. But if you look at stone A here across the centre of the circle and look for, is there a solar alignment here, it's very difficult to say because the circle has been renovated and not too accurate, it would seem. Actually, if you stand from the other direction and look back across 3 granite outlier stones across stone A, there is an alignment with the winter solstice sunset. And under the paving at stone A, there are ritual vessels which have been deposited. So there's maybe an association with New Year and rebirth, but you can't really go much further than that. Some of you will have noticed in the foreground, though, there's a Vesica Pisces, very nice one, and that's got an alignment through the notes, also pointing back to stone A. What do they mean by this? Vesica Pisces, as you'll know, has been used as a potent symbol in many cultures over many periods of time. And what Eratan's associated with, goodness only knows, your guess is as good as anybody else's. But it's there with a purpose, there's no doubt about that. So let's move on a little bit. Further south on Hortitsia Island, this is an island in the river, it's 7 miles long, we see some of these burial mounds, these kurhans. And I'm going to be telling you quite a lot about these. The Kurhan culture of Arata began around about 6000 BC, and you've got some mounds here where you can see the curbstones around the outside. I'd particularly like you to focus on that mound because Lee's going to be talking about this when I step down and she can take over. So just memorise that shape. Here's a similar Kurhan in the west of Ukraine, which is being excavated. You can see inside the mound we've got these curbstones, and it's virtually the same as what I've just shown you at Brigania. This Brigania was, without doubt, a step pyramid, one of these Kurhan burial mounds. On top of the mounds, they would position Kurhan stelae. These are anthropomorphic statues. You've got them in large numbers all the way across Ukraine, southern Russia, Mongolia, southern Siberia. And in Ukraine, they're referred to as stone babas or Kamyana babas. It comes from the Turkic word balbal, meaning grandfather or ancestor. But in Ukraine, they're largely all female. It's a matriarchal society there. Here you see the stone babas positioned on top of the kurhans, and I draw your attention once again to the curbstones around some of these kurhans, because we've seen this sort of thing before. We have. Douth. It's virtually identical. Want to see that again? You got it. And look at the big mound behind at Douth, because that pretty much the same as this one, which is an Etruscan mound that Lee and I went to back in November in Italy. We know that the Etruscans came from the Dniester area of Ukraine, And notice this mound is at Barati. They brought the name with them. This is Arata in Italy, Etruscan. But let's go back again to Ukraine. Yuri Shilov took us to one of the largest, it's probably the largest mound in Ukraine. It's still in excellent condition. It's not one of their oldest, but it was part of the Cossack annual festival, their pilgrimage. And this one is an interesting one because it begs the question, since it's really in the middle of nowhere, it really is, what makes a site special? Why did they put it here? I mean, why? The answer to that, on this little curtain down here, let me introduce you now to another Ukrainian that we've become very friendly with, and this is Dr. Vladimir Krasnoholovets. He's a theoretical physicist, a senior theoretical physicist at Kiev, and here you see him measuring inerton radiation. This is a kind of Earth energy. Now, Vladimir is, I would put to you, he's going to be the Einstein of the 21st century. Physics is in a muddle, and they can't find their way out of it. Vladimir has a clue, and his physics works. I have to tell you for a moment about the inerton field theory. It's a revolutionary description of mass derived from the structure of space. I don't mean outer space, I just mean space. How he's done this, I do not understand. But why it's important to you to understand this today is that all matter, because it has mass, has this inerton field around it. Now, the mantle rocks under the Earth's crust are a different density, so they will have a different inerton field. And where they extrude through channels, mantle channels, up to the Earth's surface, that will alter the inerton field experienced at the Earth's surface. And that is key to what we're looking at here, because it is detectable, not just by instruments, plants respond to it, and people too. You can see these mantle channels with the arrangements of grasses and mushrooms. We show you fairy rings because they're pretty. But do understand here that to get a fairy ring, it comes from one mushroom spore. Now, a mushroom cap that you put in your frying pan produces millions of spores every hour. Now, what is it that makes just one spore grow here to the exclusion of all of the others, and yet other fairy rings will develop around, often in sort of geometric patterns? There's something deep down. There's an energy field. And as I say, people are sensitive to this, you know that, and the ancients were no exception. And this has been studied also by the KGB in the 1980s. Russian physicists were exploring this Earth energy. They were particularly interested in perhaps finding ways into military potential of psychological weaponry. And they were under the protection of Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, who then took over from Brezhnev as leader. But it paved the way for other scientists to start thinking about these sort of Earth fields, for want of a better term. And here you see why we've got these two Ukrainian physicists, our friends, who are working closely together. Vladimir is developing the inerton theory and taking this into biodiesel production and medical science and food science because it's beneficial. But he's also significantly interested in the archaeology. His friend Yuri Shilov, the archaeologist, having studied hundreds of sites across Ukraine, sees the evidence on the ground that there is an earth field and that the ancients were sensitive to this. So you've got this wonderful association of archaeology and modern theoretical physics working hand in hand. Lee and I are translating Yuri Shilov's books because it's just not available in English. And Vladimir, bless him, is assisting us with the translations because there are many village sites which just don't appear in dictionaries. Let me tell you a little bit now about Yuri Shilov's work. He lives near Komsomolsk. This is on the mighty river Dnipro. This is central Ukraine, and you can see that there are two other rivers connecting in. Now, another geologist in Ukraine, Ferdu, has discovered that mounds and sanctuaries were built on the perimeters of the mantle channels that I've referred to, but particularly on promontories which are intersected by faults. And here you've got a promontory between three rivers, and it is intersected by a fault line, a geological fault line, and it has three mantle channels. Now, the geophysicists know that the energy of mantle channels is strongest on the circumference, not in the center. And surprise, surprise, no surprise, that the curtains are built on the periphery of these mantle channels. We know the mantle channels there, perhaps the ancients knew they were there, but there is this association. And it's not just here. Other sites across Russia, Ukraine, and I dare say everywhere in the world will show this connection. And I'm reminded just last week looking at David Furlong's film of his talk here last year, that he was showing sites, significant sites on the circumference in Britain of circles 37 miles diameter. The circumference energy is important. This is a geologically important area. Everything that's red there is being mined, and please notice that it's whipped across to Selnia Mound and Stop-Buvata Mound, which I'm going to show you in a moment, and these two ones are threatened of disappearing. A lot of sites are disappearing in Ukraine. But you get one of these sites, one of these Kerhans, on a mantle channel on this earth energy, and you stick a Kerhan steeler on the top. Well, people that are interested in geomancy will understand that you geopuncture a site appropriately, that really does something that's powerful. And I think that these stelae are not just put there to sort of like X marks the spot, this is somebody's grave. Oh, no. These are functional. These are functional. Well, let me show you Stop-Buvata Mound. Here's Yuri Shilov with two of his compatriots just about to open up Stop-Buvata. And Ukrainians go about this, they don't muck around. They just get out the tractors and whoosh, in we go. You know, they know how deep down they need to go. And then you go gently with the spades and the shovels and the dustpan and brush until you get down to the burial. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that all this silt area, this isn't where they've just gently polished it and carved it. This was left by the ancients. And it's particular silt, and the grave was then filled up with river silt quite deliberately. It's just soil top filling over the top. But going from that grave area, there is a long serpentine trench. And this is very, very significant, because it reflects the serpent vitra from the Aryan Rig Vedas. And we're talking about a long time before the Rig Veda itself. Now, I need to spend just a moment telling you something about the Rig Veda. There's a collection of archaic Sanskrit hymns here. But the ones that I want to refer you to is the serpent Vritra guarded a rocky enclosure, a cave or an egg stone, which was called Vala. And this was where certain demons had imprisoned the goddesses of dawn, plural, goddesses. Hero Indra, using his club, or maybe a thunderbolt, defeats Vritra, the serpent, releasing the energy of the dawn. It's sometimes also the new year. He's assisted by the god Vishnu, who famously takes 3 steps to measure out the earth, the air, and heaven. And you're going to see these symbolized now. And Kormalitsia Mound, one of the ones on these mantle channels, which I've just shown you, here we've got clearly the serpent trench, and the burials in red immediately around, and there's an egg altar in the middle, which the serpent is guarding. Interestingly, we've got small stelae carved. There's Indra with his club, and these stelae are in the serpent trench. Around the egg altar guarding it, we've got Vishnu stelae, typically showing him with his footprint, highly characteristic, and the stelae even foot-shaped. And they're positioned around the egg altar guarding it, so to assist in the release of the new dawn, or more appropriately probably, the new year. I now need to tell you a little bit about how these Kerhans were constructed. Here's a typical example at Belozersky, it's 2,500 BC. The corpse, they initially partially burn it. It's not a complete cremation. They then cover it over with a cross-shaped fillet of soil, and on top of that, make a little crater and put a bonfire in. This is not the bonfire that burned the body. This is another bonfire. And that's overlaid with another fillet in the shape of a bird, often with a yellow clay circle on its back. So the message that you're getting here is the spirit from the body is released upwards through the fire to be carried to heaven by the bird. The layering is significant, and we've seen this sort of layering a moment ago in the world axis. It's the same sort of cultural, spiritual belief. There's an even more interesting mound here at, see if I can pronounce it, Svortsovsky, where what they've done is burned a huge oval of ground so that it's all blackened. Into the center of this, they lay they lay a yellow yolk of clay and dig a little man-sized pit in the center, which is called the fiery embryo. They don't put a body in here. This has a nobody in here. And having done all that, they cover it over with river silt, earth and water. And at that stage, they then, outside the area, dig 2 trenches. There's the club of Indra and the staff of Vishnu. They then build 2 sun pillars out of yellow clay, orientated northeast to the summer solstice sunrise. Having done all this, they cover the mound over with straw, burn it, and onto this they throw a dismembered horse. to take the horse through into the next world. That done, they cover the whole thing over with another layer of river silt, and now it's time for the human burials. These are rather bizarre. We've got 3. They're always done in 3s. The first one is a sacrificial child, dismembered even down to the finger bones, totally dismembered. They replace the brain with river silt. And they then reassemble all the bones in an embryonic position facing southwest, the winter solstice sunset, the start of the new year. In the centre of the mound, on top, that they built it up to now, they put a normal burial with the standard sort of grave goods. And facing northeast, outside the mound area, there is a partially burned corpse facing northeast for the summer solstice sunrise, the time when, if you like, the year is in its maturity. So we've got here the symbolism showing transfer from bringing life into the world from the netherworld at the new year, passing through an earthly life, and then progressing on to heaven. It's highly ritualistic. Now let me show you that petroglyph again. You've clearly got the serpent for the underworld, the netherworld. This now is not a man, this is the child. We've got a horse, and 2, with a fire symbol, burning. We've got the priestess and the dismembered body. We've got the staff of Vishnu and the club of Indra. We've got the burial mound with the body inside it. And it's arranged in layers going up. It's not quite the same as Fort Sovsky, but let me remind you, that petroglyph is 22,000 BC from the Library of Shunan. Now, I find that awesome. Incidentally, these, I haven't been able to translate what they are, but I suspect it's the winter solstice sunset and the summer solstice sunrise with a curtain post on top of it. Let me take you back there. And they didn't stop there. They would then plough a trench in the shape of a footprint all the way around. Here you've got the club and the staff, the body being cremated, ploughed henge there. We've got the club of Indra, the staff of Vishnu, and the footprint of Vishnu, the 3 symbols measuring out the earth, the sky, and heaven. We've got the primeval egg Vala in the centre of the mound, cleaved by Vishnu's staff, so that the embryo god is carried by the fiery horse to heaven. You've got to associate that with Pegasus, surely. The god grows to maturity by passing through 3 worlds, the netherworld, earthly world, and heaven. And if you hadn't already spotted it, that footprint is 360 foot lengths long. It's the year it's solstitially aligned. These guys knew what they were doing. They really did. I have to stop now before I hand over to Lee, because I've probably run a little bit over time. Ooh, no, maybe not too bad. I just wanted to show you this one, because here's another burial mound at Kongar. It's down towards the Crimea Peninsula. It's 0.5 kilometre long. I mean, it's huge. But you've got a mound as Vitra, the serpent Vitra. You've got Vishnu's staff with a little handle, and you've got the egg positioned and guarded in Vitra. This is where the fiery embryo for the dawn of the new year is. Again, 3 burials. But these ones were partially cremated, all 3, and it's significant. Vishnu's staff, the tip of it, once again appears to be gently releasing the dawn from Vala, which the serpent Vitra guards. It's Vedic. I'm sorry, it's Vedic. I'm going to finish now, but let me just remind you what you've seen. Sanctuary observatories on geoenergetic sites with solar alignments and a functional choice of constructional materials of those boundaries. We've got concepts of afterlife and spiritual movement between the worlds. We've got the familiar deities in Arata many, many, many millennia before they appear in Sumer or in the Indus Valley. The stone library itself is impressive enough, 22,000 BC. Kafishin in his book, published in 2001, says it's 42,000 BC. Ukraine is the homeland of Arata. Arata is the earliest known civilization. Ukraine is on the map. Lee, I think it's time for you to take over.
Year 1900, Pablo Picasso made his way to Paris on his very first visit. And he was going, along with 50 million other people, to this Exposition Universelle, the Great Exhibition of Paris. And being a good communist, one of the very first things that he did was to go along to the pavilion of Soviet Russia so that he could see what was on show from this land that he admired so much. And what he saw took his breath away. In fact, it changed his life, and it certainly affected his art. What he discovered was that he was looking at ancient Ukraine in the face, and he had no idea this was here. It goes by the name of Tripilia, and Tripilia civilization is known as the Neolithic Eden. And we're talking about a date of 8,000 years ago. And this is the sort of artwork that they were producing. Picasso was stunned. He just couldn't believe the shapes, the forms, the energy, the movement of these wonderful pieces. And he perhaps looked at them and saw abstract art, which then influenced what came later. But what I'm saying to you is that these were abstracted from the phenomena that the Tripilian people were seeing and experiencing. So let's go through the portal. Let's go back 8,000 years ago to see what it was that made these Aratan Tripilians tick, what interested them. Well, when the first settlement of Tripilians was discovered in 1893 in a little village near Kiev, this was about the time when across the world marvellous cities were being unearthed. You have Troy, you have Mycenae, you have Knossos, and then a little bit later we have Sumer discovered in Mesopotamia. So Ukrainian archaeologists were pretty amazed to find that they had their own wonderful history on their doorstep. So far, about 2,000 of these settlements have been found, but we're still into fairly early days of archaeological uncoverings. The date of this culture at the moment, they think, goes back to about 6,200 BCE, and then it's very suddenly extinguished at the start of the 3rd millennium BCE. Now, the same culture didn't recognize national borders. You see the same culture experienced in Romania and Moldova, but in those countries it goes by the name of Cucuteni. What really distinguishes the culture is the fact that it was peaceful. They've never found any evidence of war. They've never found any artifacts to do with war until the very end of the culture. There was no adversarial language. This is peaceful, perhaps because it's egalitarian, where males and females shared, and perhaps also because there was no class, there was no slaveholding. Now, Tripilia was at the very heart of this ancient state that Tim was describing of Arata. And the word Arata beautifully means country lit up by the sun. So the sun was central to the concept of Arata. And as Tim has said, it was formed before the 20th millennium BCE. I'd like us to look at the words of Professor Senchenko of the UN to see how he describes Arata, which was regulated by priests, but remember, these are priests of the Neolithic and Paleolithic. These are not the priests later where they just got slightly too much of a dose of the ego and started controlling society. These were all for community base. So regulated by priest, it was the most advanced state until the extinction of the mammoths, when the very last keepers deposited the old wisdom at Shu Nun Stone Mound in the 12th millennium BC. And the Tripilian culture is the apotheosis of this old state of Arata, which was considered to be the ancestral home of Sumer, later separated owing to the world flood and the breakthrough of the Med to the Black Sea. So here in Arata, we also have the formation of the Aryan tribes, and these Brahmin priests formed the Vedic culture, the one that Tim was showing you just now. Now, Arata is generally known by the name the ploughman state, and immediately you think of agriculture, but I'm going to suggest to you that there was another meaning to the plough in this society. Now, the name for the oikumene of Arata, all the world known to man, was Aratagar, which means the four corners of the earth. And Arata benignly and altruistically guided this territory. It didn't rule it, it guided and regulated the territory through its priestly expeditions and through controlled migrations. There was an enormous migration into Sumer, or that area that became Sumer in Mesopotamia, because of the flood of the Sea of Azov, because the whole basin of the Sea of Azov at one time was known as Sumer, and all the names that were taken into Sumer are still around that Meotid lake area. Now, it controlled it by sanctuary observatories, and as I said, it was altruistically taking out all the technology that it knew about and all its conceptual precepts. And this is why we find that there are ready-made cultures like Sumer that the archaeologists could not understand, with very sophisticated judicial, legislative, education systems, trade, industry, irrigation systems, all ready-made. It was sent out partly through the ancient fleets on the Black Sea from a place that we know as Odessa today, but Oriana in those days. And these people, the Usatovo culture, are the ones who later went on to found the Greek culture. And they brought to the world their images of the great earth that was always represented as a circle and indeed as concentric circles, which is the origin, bottom right, of the Matrushka dolls, where you still see those little nested concentric circles. Now, I'm coy about telling you the extent of Arata, but the books that have been published do talk about it going as far east as China, as we've seen with Kitoi, and as far west as Britain and Ireland. We know that they went into Palestine and the Golan Heights, and that's the reason that I'm putting in Rum Hiri, or Gilgal Rephaim, because this was a concentric nested astronomical observatory. Another example of one of the cities in concentric circles is Petrani in Moldova. And the Indus Valley civilization, as Tim has said, went by the first name of Bharata. Now, what really marked out Arata was the size of its cities. They were huge, the largest in the world. They were geometrically interesting. Now, we've already seen Petrani, and we've also seen the importance of the footprint of Vishnu, and the largest city found to date at Talyanki. It may seem tiny to us at over 1,000 acres and with a population of 15,000, but it was the largest of its day. Often these cities were surrounded by moats or circular canals. And just to give you some sense of scale, there is the huge city of Petrani, where each dot is a structure overlaid on Talyanki. Now, in between the size of the two was another concentric shape, but this time in an oval, the city of Maidenet, from the same sort of date in the 6th millennium. And this was only about 250 hectares. And very handily for archaeologists, the Trypillians had a habit of very periodically burning their cities, which leaves a good magnetic fingerprint in the burnt clay. Nobody's sure why they did this. It's speculated that it's something to do with the phoenix notion of regeneration and a way of linking this particular land and territory directly through to the ancestors. And it's to do with the earth and cosmos being linked in the ether field. And far, far to the east, I'm going to show you an Aryan city that we're going to look at in detail shortly, in the Urals, called Archaim, because Archaim, again, it's these concentric circles, but this has still evidence of one of the stunning astronomical observatories. Now, the observatories accompanied virtually all of the Trypillian settlements, whether they were tiny farms or large cities. You get the observatory. How did they live? I think very beautifully. The hut that you see on the top is a reconstruction at the Arata Ukraine Museum. Most of the houses were raised up on stilts. They were single, 2 stories, sometimes 3 stories, connected by bridges. all built contiguously together, whatever the shape, if it was circles, if it was oval, whatever, they were all built sort of cheek by jowl, close together. And at a reconstruction that was done out in the Vatican at the conference that we were speaking at last October, they tried to show that these were very sophisticated living conditions where you've got running water, you've got privacy, which seems an astonishing thing for the Neolithic era. They did have a window in, circular, of course. But what Trypillia, where the voice really comes through, is in the symbols. And the best known symbols of Trypillia are the swastika and the yin-yang symbol. What was at the absolute core of their belief systems was a belief in reincarnation, and hence the sort of preponderance of the serpentine energy that you can see on the centre panel, because they saw the serpent connected with the earth and the revitalisation. And I think these are very elegant and very eloquent texts, trying to communicate with each other, not to us, but it's taken a lot of reading, a lot of looking at text to try and piece together what is their central concept. And there's absolutely no doubt about it. They believed in post-mortem mobility. They believed that after death, that there was a survival of consciousness, because they thought that the mind transcended the physical body and the physical brain. And remarkably, they found ways through this gateway into this greater consciousness. Now, they did this, first of all, by receiving the wisdom of those who they couldn't see to start with, through a medium. And by a medium, I mean the priest who was acting as an intercessor. They also did it through mediating substances, entheogens, and perhaps the most famous one of those is soma, or homa, which is thought to perhaps be based on a shrub, possibly on a mushroom, Amanita muscaria. What we do know is that they found cannabis sativa at the sites, and it wasn't just for single usage. This was done on a community-wide, thousands at a time basis. The other strong influence on the Trypillians was astronomy. They were great astronomers, great calendar shapers, and so they recorded what they saw. And astonishingly, perhaps 70% of the symbols that we have in our world today, and I mean all across, whether it's washing powder, washing machines, petrol station logos, cars, come from this one civilization. The goddess figurines, as they're called, are very different to the ones that we see in the Paleolithic. These are very slimline, and they tend to be of two types, either without a head at all, or where they do have heads, they tend to be masks and not faces. The other thing that you'll notice about the body is they have marks on them, and these are thought to be tattoos. And we know that people tattooed their skins as well, from the rather gruesome arm from the Scythian burial that you can see. Now, very decorative, but what we're suggesting is that the tattoos had a specific function. The geometry of what was laid out on the body mattered, whether it was a rhombus, whether it was a triangle, whatever. Because the very action, the very intent of putting something on to the body was a way of stimulating, forcing, I mean a physical force, forcing a mirroring energy response, a bit like, I think it's called Bowen technique, where one just presses the body and it brings the meridian and nadi channels from the bioenergetic field forward to perform a function. And what it seemed to be doing for them is very much opening a flow through to superconsciousness, to the cosmos. So this is suggesting a very developed sense of order in the world and also of boundaries. And the reason I put in at the bottom, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, is because this is Newton's third law of motion. And if you know anything about his work, you will know that the majority of Newton's research was on occult physics. That doesn't mean it's magical, it just means it's concealed or hidden. He knew that in the ether field something existed, and he couldn't get to grips with it. And had he known about this, it would have just jolted his work forward so rapidly. And I put that in the little triangle, because most of the goddesses on that little bikini area seem to wear a triangle, and it's to do with the creative cosmic concept that we'll come back to shortly. So they knew about boundaries to the spirit world. They thought, these ancestors thought that there were ways to cross through them. They found ways to cross through them at particular places, particularly where the sky and the earth touched, as they said it. But in order to look at that, we need to go back to look at some of the serpents. And the most magnificent serpent wall crosses the whole of Ukraine into Romania, all the way through to the Danube, 1,000 kilometres long. Parts of it, they think, date back to this Vedic Aratan period. And this seems to have been a time when people were very aware of perhaps these ley lines, or what they called woovers. And indeed, the name of their early Druid priests were called woovers, these energized paths. And what we think is happening is that these serpent walls were very much part of an energy harnessing system. But it wasn't just that. They were also acting as boundaries between the material and the spiritual world. In other words, the difference between sacred and profane space. And this comes from a very archaic concept to do with fixing the axis mundi. It wasn't in one place, it was wherever this ploughing was created. So the ploughing the borders was creating a cosmos or a universe. That is not up there in the sky. It's not where Carl Sagan said his series was. That was a very, very late concept, well after the Greeks. At this time, the cosmos is something that man has helped to delineate. It's beyond this world, it's metaphysical, but it's in a way of this world as well. Now, the cosmos was split into mortal and immortal realms. And it was a way for mankind to reincarnate, always in the hope of coming through to the immortal, but mainly going back from dark to light, reality to unreality, until some were lucky enough to pass through the gates of immortality and to come through into the immortal cosmos, to reach Eden, the harmonic point of absolute beginning. And it's what all of it was about. It was all about reaching Eden. Now, as Professor Sheila was saying here, what they were managing to do was remarkable. It wasn't just philosophical. They were physically removing a contradiction between life and death. And they did it by constructing an altar receiver. What may that be? And what is it for? Well, it was a way of meeting the ancestor gods and awakening the psyche and intellectual empowerment. And it was like a hierophantic enclosure. Something happened here. And if you'll forgive me using the word henge outside of British contexts, it could have been a henge, it could have been a dolmen, it could have been a mound at which this exchange took place. So these are quite complex conceptual ideas about life and death and the human psyche. So how would they get these ideas across? I think they did it most imaginatively. They had a concept, it seems, of the twin self. And these very enigmatic vessels of the binocular vessels or the twinned pairs seem to be expressing the illusion that we are separate from some universal consciousness. And I only found out recently that the Mojave name for the soul is Shu Nun, the same name as that primordial mound that Tim was showing you earlier. What this represents for the psyche is a huge cognitive leap, because they are suddenly transcending responses to the environment and actually starting to find a new way of presenting reality, one in which, remarkably, form is now mapped onto meaning. There was a particular group of priests called the penetration priests, otherwise known as consciousness priests, who we know were working with electrical energies to bring these two halves into phase, rather like a sine wave, in order to make sure that the individual was rejoined with the universal. Now, the sine wave has got a beautiful geometric relationship to the circle, and as we've seen, the circle was very important in ancient Ukraine. And I think what we're saying here is that architecture matters, and that when people say, oh, there's nothing left of the old culture to see, there is no architecture, megaliths and mounds and walls are those old architectures. And I've jammed.
It's okay. Press the escape key. So. Just hum to yourselves for a minute.
At last, scientists have noticed that there is an enormous belt of megalithic observatories at 51 degrees north and slightly above and below that line. And it's interesting that most of us, I think, tend to make the assumptions that what was happening in the Neolithic era in the sky is pretty similar to what we see now. I would beg to differ. I think that they were seeing something very, very different. We know that there have been very strong solar outbursts in the past. We still have the end of the torrid meteor storms in a very degraded form now. Could have been supernova. It could be that they were building, whatever they were building, is a response like an early warning system, possibly. So let's look at the accounts from history to see what we're looking at. And there is a fantastic, very well-attested account about a strange star in the sky called Nibiru, that went by the name of Vesperugo by Plautus and Hesperus by Homer. And what was remarkable about it is that it changed its size, its colour, its form and its course. And that it was happening during the reign of Ogyges, the Attic and Egyptian king. What we do know is that what happened after this went through the skies was a tremendous flood. So somebody was responsible for it, and some fingers are pointed at Venus, but now it seems they may be looking at Proto-Enki as a culprit for this phenomena. And when I say phenomena, I mean there were things to see in the sky, what we call plasma phenomena, that took real shapes. We're all familiar with the auroral curtain, and this is the same sort of thing that's causing it, plasma in the atmosphere. And what people would have seen is a remarkable stream of charged particles of radiation coming through the Earth's magnetic fields, following the currents, and producing these sheets and curtains of shapes, disturbing the geomagnetic field. Well, I think that plasma discharge offers a lot of sense in terms of trying to interpret what was happening in ancient Ukraine. Now, we'll take one example, and it's this charmingly named squatting man petroglyph system. This is something that we see all over the world, and we've got a couple of examples from Ukraine, perhaps not the best ones, but it's to show the squatting man petroglyphs that they mimic the form of what are called Birkeland currents, which is plasma, and these tendencies that they have to what's called Z-pinch, which you can see up in the Bug Nebula. And they Z-pinch into distinctive shapes in the sky as a result of instabilities in the ionized particles. And if you were to do this in the laboratory, what you would end up with is that purple shape, the top left, which has been whitened for clarity. And you can see instantly the similarity between the two. Now, if this was just one instance, it would be perhaps coincidence. But when you have thousands of matches, not just for the squatting man, for all sorts of other phenomena, you are looking at something that is more than coincidental. On the tropylian ceramics that I've shown you, there are examples here of what happens to the plasma when it's in a pillar form and becomes pinched and segmented or collimated, and you see a lovely phenomenon that they call now stacked ancestors or stretched ancestors. Now, Dr. Tony Peratt, who works at Los Alamos National Laboratory, is in absolutely no doubt that these petroglyphs are reproductions of plasma phenomena in space. And he's working closely with the man who did these beautiful images, Dave Talbot, to have these two fields working together to show us what may have been happening in the sky. And they think that there was at one time a very close axial alignment between Saturn as the brown blob, Venus as a violently discharging star as the white material, and little Mars at the front of it. And in conjunction, depending on where the phase was and where you were standing on the Earth, you would have seen these shapes appear that they say have been translated into symbols like the white crown of Egypt, like the Slavic or Egyptian top or side lock, and all the other familiar things. So, John Michel said a very prescient thing, as he tended to do, because he remarked about the remains of a universal system of natural magic that involved the use of polar magnetism. Well, because this plasma phenomena was happening at the North Pole, I would suggest that perhaps what John would have liked to have seen is that this is the answer. It was plasma. Now, I said I'd come back to Archaim because it was a remarkable astronomical observatory. And in this line of megaliths as architectural pieces, it doesn't look like there's a lot there, but a lot has been drawn out of this. And I'm going to do a direct comparison with something familiar, Stonehenge, to look at the amount of data that has been extracted. And at Archaim, compared to Stonehenge, we have just slightly more observational data from solar and lunar evidence. But it's when it comes to the precision that we're looking at only 10 arc minutes a degree at Stonehenge and 1 arc minute a degree at Archaim. Very detailed, but it gets better. This ancient observatory is also showing us that these people understood that the pole has gone through various fixed positions over time. They've also suggested the golden ratio, John Martineau's real territory. They have articulated the zodiac here. They were recognizing fluctuations in power. They had alignments to the sun, to the moon, to the lunar orbits in relation to the ecliptic. And they also were showing evidence of axial precession. But what really stunned me is that Archaim shows evidence of bringing together two geometries which converge at a point where the angle of the summer solstice sunrise at this little marker stone is 52.65. And that, remarkably, corresponds to the geographical latitude of Archaim. It would have been exact, but they are taking the height of the horizon from a local mountain. So, stunning precision. Now, I have here a pentagonal geometry done by my friend David. And it's because the pentagonal geometries are revealing something remarkable. The inner harmonic is the visible material hard part. This is where we exist. This is where we become shape and form. And it's because we are out of phase between these circles that we become visible in this field. It's where we exist as a mathematical energy in a homogeneous system. Archaim today is still a remarkable place. It's the place where you can actually feel something different in the earth. All sorts of things are going on about variations in temperature, etc. And it's all because of the data that Tim was talking about, that these mantle channels. And it's evident that priests were choosing these areas very deliberately to do something. So because of all the phenomena, it's hardly surprising that today Archaim is the #1 destination in the world for psychic tourism, because people love the feeling of just sort of floating, feeling disembodied. But what we think this was for is that people were actually tapping into something, tapping into a higher consciousness, into this electromagnetic energy at these sites. And Archaim was not on its own. There are at least 20 other towns in this area. I actually think they weren't towns at all, that they were just places to go to for something to happen. And there seems to be a relationship between the shape of the sites and an axial relationship with what's going on out in the skies. Now, Tim said to look out for that Kurhan that you saw earlier, because what I think we're looking at here is a chambered cairn. And we know that chambered cairns were used for healing purposes. And in the text, it talks about them renovating body organs in structures like this according to the principle of collective cells, like a beehive. So it's as though they were incubating people for healing. And because we live in a world of vibration and resonance, which can slip out of tune, they seem to bring us back into phase, making, from taking us from sickness back to health. So the sages and the priests of ancient Ukraine seem to be mastering bioenergetic field technology. Another thing that I think they were doing was healing people in a different way, doing it in a communal way. And what I'm suggesting is that one of the structures they have there, from all the concentric timber posts, was that they had an amphitheatre. And we know that there was a link with amphitheatres being associated with healing, because at Epidaurus in Greece, at Gand in France, as well as the famous Kolos Circle or the wooden Colosseum, that they practiced healing. And it's as though they are a bioenergetic temple for either curing people or from preventing harm to the body. And this was produced through the collective mind by using a resonant technology, rather like cymatics and Dr. Hans Jenny's work in recovering this, which was imprinting geometric patterns on the mind to bring it back into phase. And anyone who knows the Gibson Amphitheatre in Los Angeles, I hope they will forgive me for overlaying this on the map of Archaim to show what I mean about an amphitheatre. So from what we've seen and what Tim was talking about earlier, there are definite links at one time in man's history to places that matters, geomantic forces that mattered, all to do with bringing in electrical energy to heal or to get to heaven in the cosmos. And this is what their dolmens were about as well. If you notice, they have a lovely aperture at the front. And I'm going to suggest, following on from what Chris was saying earlier, that this was acting in the same way as Newgrange. This quartz plug that filled a little hole, at a particular time in the lunar cycle, this quartz, when the reverse energy came through it, would have glowed. And this was the signal for the penetration priest or consciousness priest to say, the site is ready, we start using it. This geologist is saying that they were operating like magnetrons, where they were doing these very short wavelength energies in a microwave form, so that people could change their consciousness in these places. And it seems as though the fractal nature of the field they were working in was superimposing a memory, that I call dark energy, of the previous states of ancestors or gods. And hence the reason, because all of this energy gathers at the top, at the apex, you have the stone babbas on the top. Now, how did they do this? Well, lots and lots of ways are described. I will just take you through perhaps the less strange ones, which was to do with the matter, mind, and energy. It seems very invasive, but they actually trepanated the skull, drilling holes, taking sections out in order to heighten consciousness. They did the same with cranial deformation at birth in order to empower people. The other thing they did was to empower the seat of the soul, the psyche, to have the pranic energy rising through the channels to join with the universal mind. And here we have again this little cosmic creative principle on the goddesses. And they practiced Kundalini yoga, which Carl Jung said you should never do, it's extremely dangerous. But it's to empower the psyche. And it was thought that this was partially a vitality that resided in the body, in the squishy bits of the brain and the spine marrow, which is said to turn into a serpent at death. And indeed, the whole object of Kundalini yoga is to awaken the serpent, to cross through the consciousness centres, to meet over the top of the body. And we think that the Sahelnia Kurgan that Tim was showing you earlier is a consciousness-themed burial, where you get the two serpents meeting at the altar receiver and joining the pranic energies together. So what they were doing is actually voyaging into other worlds, which may seem strange, but it's no different, I would say, to a Victorian traveller who, when he went on a trip, would just prepare well, be ready to meet new people, keep a record of his journey, and then share it with people afterwards. This is not supernatural. This is simply a science or a process that we've only got the coattails of and don't quite understand. But what was evident is that there was real contact within this body sphere of the anthroposphere. This is the realm where man could travel from the Vedic earthly Yavi into Navi, the Vedic realm of death, and come back again. This is a living person having communion with the ancestors. And he did it by prepared intent, at the altar receiver, within this field that goes by the name of information, bioenergetic, inerton, whatever. It's even God to some people. So in this fertile garden of Eden, this harmonic point of absolute beginning in pure consciousness, man was able to meet his ancestors and his gods. This is the only place where he could drink the sweet water of the source. This is where he received the radiant intellect of the ancestors. And Chris was saying earlier, what was it that triggered people out of that Paleolithic mindset? I think it was because they found a way through to this universal consciousness. This is what the Neolithic revolution was. It was a revolution in human consciousness. And it was realized through reaching Eden. And Eden is a concept. It's a metaphysical realm of pure consciousness. And I make no apologies for ending up with Stonehenge. If it's really part of Errata, then it sort of fits the bill. And here it's been overlaid with Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man and a couple of 7 and 17 geometries to focus in on the centre. Because when man and geometry come together, something seems to come through those little gaps, those little interstices, these geometric patterns that are made up of vibrations and frequencies and resonances within this field. And it's as though Leonardo understood and knew this, because there's such a beautiful fit of the measure of man uniting reason and uniting belief to universal higher consciousness. So the man here is representing universal humanity, materializing through and from the mathematical energy of pattern, showing the perfection of the universe. So man hasn't invented numbers, he hasn't invented geometry, he's a consequence of them. And geometry is not related to creation, it is creation. So, to answer the question that Megalithomania poses every year, what were they up to? Well, they seem to have discovered a way of empowering the psyche, of achieving remarkable levels of superconsciousness by creating this cosmos or enclosure, congregating at a particular place on a particular date, coming together for the same reason, being prepared, and then sharing what they've learned with other people. And I think if we leave out the surgery, that pretty much amounts to a very good conference ethos. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening.